call the committee in order for Monday, February 17th, 2025 to order. Roll call, please.
Trustee Salzar.
Here.
Trustee Lowry.
Here.
Trustee Curtis.
Here.
Mayor Gaffino.
Here.
Trustee Christensen.
Here.
Trustee Nedvedge.
Here.
And Trustee Gately.
All right, thank you. First item on discussion, Steve.
Thank you, Mayor. First item in discussion tonight, and the only item is regarding water connection fees. Basically, here. So a little bit of background, the water system that we have is currently going through a life cycle review. Our fees haven't been updated for more than 10 years. These are connection fees that we'll get into a little bit more. These are the fees that are paid at the time of development. So when somebody's coming in at the time of building permit, this is the tap on fee to basically connect to our system. Right now, as we start to have our aging infrastructure, and when I say aging, we're talking about wear and tear over years on our wells, on our treatment plants. We're building a brand new tower, so now we'll have 3, and then the other 2 are also obviously aging. What we do is we're trying to do a master study that's been going on for 1.5 years with the EEI. And if you remember, this is a massive study. This is a study that takes 1 year to 2 years to complete. The cost of the study was almost $300,000. So it wasn't like this is a 2-week study and then we have an answer. This study has been very intensive, and they're looking at things such as, what our current water capabilities are, how much water we can provide the residents, what the flow rate is for, in the where there's low water pressure, where there's high water pressure. Capital planning. So they're looking at all of our infrastructure to trying to determine whether or not in its life cycle, should it be replaced, repaired, removed, abandoned, new, something different, put in future water sources in here too. That's discussion of the quality of our aquifer, where we get all of our water for our deep water aquifer. Is the life of that aquifer going to be around for 30 years, 50 years, 100 years? And if not, what's our alternatives for finding potable water? And then the other aspect of this is water rates, which is, at the end, water rates is taking all of this into account. Here's the capital plan you need to address these water issues for the future. This is what you should be charging to now put that fee towards those improvements over time. So the study reviews impacts as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about population equivalence as we go on. It's a formula that basically assesses how much water a particular user might use on our water system. The one thing I did want to note is that the village did pass an ordinance on large water users last year at this time. And that was because we're getting to the point where our water rates are starting to fall behind. They're much cheaper than neighboring towns per se. But as we look to ramp up those water rates, what you're finding is you're going to find more companies that are looking to move here because they want to use a lot of water and it'll be advantageous for them to do so. But what's not advantageous is the impact they create on our system that we're not collecting. So the idea of the water user study was that anyone who came in here with 5,000 gallons a day of water usage automatically triggers a study. The study goes through our Department of Admin and Public Works. Kevin is working on a water agreement with one entity in town right now. And we walk through how much water they're going to use, and we go through with them and try to figure out what that impact fee is based on their water usage. So what is a water connection fee? As I said earlier, it's typically paid at the time that you're first coming onto the system. It does take into effect the cost of our wells, our treatment plants, and our towers. What connection fees don't do, and what they're not really generating to do, is maintain our current system. That's essentially what water rates do, is water rates are basically providing for the operational costs of your water system and putting some money aside for routine maintenance, maybe a normal water main program every year where we remove a section of water main and replace it. But when you're talking about things that are high impact, the need to build a $7.5 million dollar tower because water user is going to use so much water that it requires more storage. Those are the impacts where the rates are climbing slightly to meet operational goals, but all of a sudden someone comes in and says, I need to use so much water. That impact goes like straight up. And all of a sudden it's the gap that we're not collecting that fee for to offset that impact to our system. So just a very quick overview. This is our current fee structure in our code. So there you see in the chart, that's what we charge. It's based on the size of the water service going into the building. So you won't see a lot of 6 or 8. I think we have one 6-inch connection. It's basically an interconnect with Aurora for a development out west. And then most of the residential, for instance, is 1 inch or 1.5 inch. That's a typical residential service. Commercial, nowadays, you're seeing mostly 3 inches or more. Depends though. If it's a small business that doesn't use a lot of water, they might still come in at 1.5 or 2 inches. But typically residential is where you see all of our single family is going to fall under that 1 or 1.5 inch. Now, I just mentioned, so I don't want to waste any time, but you see on the side, anyone over 5,000, that's what triggers that study. So in looking at our water fees, if you look at the chart here, it does a really good job of, and I give Brandon a lot of credit for putting a lot of the charts together. You look at the average consumption. So that light blue line, the top line, is basically what the consumption by size of your service is, how that's going up. So it's taking the average user within each of those categories of size of pipe. So taking all of those users that have 1-inch lines in town, the average person uses this. And the dark blue line is how our fees have gone up. Basically, connection fees proportionally match that. Meaning, if you look, the impact fee is sorely lacking as we start to move up in size. The amount of water being used by the average consumer is far exceeding what we're actually charging to capture that impact. And that's the gap right there, as you see in the widening at the end. What we want to do is stop basing our rates on the size water line that you're using in your building. We want to base it on what you might actually, the amount of water you may actually use, because that's the impact to our system. So here's a comparison that it kind of just, elaborate a little bit further. This chart shows commercial industrial accounts, and you see 5/8 inch, that's outdated. We don't do 5/8 inch anymore, but we do have people that are on older lines that still have that. So in our water system, this is a snapshot. We just looked at January's billing. So the two-month billing cycle, December, January. And then when you're looking at that, what you're seeing is the highest water user in every category in the dark blue, and then the average user in that category in the orange. And as you see, you can barely see any orange in those categories. And what we're trying to illustrate is that not everybody uses water the same way. I can have a 1-inch service. You can have a 1-inch service. I might use 300 gallons a day, but you might use 4,000 gallons a day. But you're paying the same fee at the time of connection that I am, and I'm using 1/10 of what you're using. Now, this chart is the exact same chart, but we added 4-inch. And then, the 4-inch encapsulates, the reason we did it is the scale was so hard to show that on this one, you wouldn't even see what the orange would be on those other categories. It was so low. So here, we have a few users that have 4-inch meters in town. Only a handful, but look at the average they're using, 228,000 gallons a day.
Wow.
And the average user, I'm sorry, repeat that. The average user is using 17,000 gallons a day, but one user alone is using 228,000. So more than 10 times the average. And that person, that business, that's the impact we're trying to capture going forward, is that if you're going to use that much water, you're different than the average water user. And that means that you should pay a fair share more. This one is residential and multifamily, for all intents and purposes here, is basically buildings with 1 meters that go to multiple units, just for reference. But this one's good because it shows you, look at the single family homes, you're really going to see, once again, all new single family homes being built are basically 1 or 1.5 inch services. And you can see, if you get to that 2-inch mark, you can see when the commercial businesses start to come in, there's an actual jump in the average user on a 2 and 3-inch line. Sorry, I should say that that's multifamily. So those are the apartment buildings that you're now seeing built. What happens is every house has, let's say, a 1.5 inch line going to a brand new house. Every apartment building each complex is a little different, but the way that we see apartments being built now, we've had multiple apartment complexes come in. They'll have a service go to the building. So that could be a 2 or 3 inch, more likely a 3-inch line. And then once it goes to the building, they're paying for the connection of a 3-inch line, but it's really going to 20 units in that building. And each unit is essentially a family that's living there using water. So they're getting charged the same in certain aspects based on the size meter, but their usage is much different than a single family house is. So what we want to do, and I'm going to start going through PEs, and then we're going to kind of compare these a little bit further. What we want to do is start using population equivalents. Other towns that are doing studies are using population equivalents. Once again, the easiest way to explain this is a population equivalent is the amount of water an average person uses in one day. And so the IEPA already tells us that they expect that the average person uses 100 gallons of water per day. That's their calculations. So what you do for things like commercial and industrial, you get your PE by basically saying, if I'm a business and I'm going to use 550 gallons a day, I divide that by 100 gallons a day and I get a PE of 5.5. That population equivalence is saying that that business is going to use the same amount of water as 5.5 people every day. Why that's important is that number then gets multiplied by the price per person, and that's how you come up with your connection fee. So how do you calculate a connection fee using a population equivalent? So once again, it's the anticipated water use. I'm going to use the example again that, my business wants to use 550 gallons a day. What happens behind the scenes is in a formula that was created by EEI that we worked with them on, and they're taking industry standards to come up with this formula. They're taking the cost of a well. They're taking the cost of the proportional amount of water to treat it at a treatment plant. And then they're taking the blended cost to build a tower. We used, because we have very good data, because we just bid and then worked with CB&I on a contract for a 1 million and a 1.25 million gallon tower. So we know how much.
I have a quick question. So what are you using to project the anticipated water usage? Would that be provided by the user, or do we have a way to by industry?
Yeah. So originally what we talked about was when a business comes in, commercial or industrial, the engineer who will stamp the plans or whatever can provide, using a formula, a PE. What we're actually proposing to do to make it more simple is to do it based on size of meter. And so this way we know all you have to do is, we're not taking an engineer's word for it when the developer comes in and he's like, hey, we're only going to use 10 gallons a day. And then you're like, I'm not sure about that. We know what their pipe is. We know what the average user in those categories use. So we're trying to base it off of that. And that's
Did
where
they
we're going.
appeal? Would they have an opportunity to appeal that projection versus actual usage if they have a trend line history? If we're saying that they should be using 5 PE and it comes up they're using 4, do they have an appeal for that?
I think we'll get to that in the next couple slides, but basing it on that would be really hard then, because if they then use more water later on, they're showing you history, but if history changes after they come in and start using more water, the only mechanism we would have to go after them for the increase in fees, let's say they tell us, and this happens, that they only plan on production of a certain amount of water, but then all of a sudden they want to do more water because their productions are efficient and they just want to do more. Well, we're not collecting a fee then on that extra amount of water they're using because we reduced it at the time they came in. But that's what we're trying to figure out. And that's why we're using blended averages for commercial accounts. But so here you're taking that proportional amount and it comes up with a dollar amount. And then you multiply it by people. So before we get into commercial and industrial accounts and residentials, I thought the easiest way to do this, that's kind of the backup. This is what we're proposing. So take large water users. It's the easiest one. Right now, we said 5,000 gallons a day. If you use 5,000 gallons a day, you have to come in and get a water study done. That number, we did it at the time where we're trying to figure out what a good number is. We've done some more research. We actually think that number, to do what the board and what the staff had presented, what we intended, we think that number is actually closer to 15,000 gallons a day. So unless you're going to use 15,000 gallons a day, we don't think you need to have an extra study. You can just pay the impact fee at the time you come in. And to put that in perspective, we only have a handful of businesses that have 15,000 gallons a day or more, which is how we came up with that number. We kind of looked at the line of the big water users, and you have a couple industrials, you have a couple of senior centers. Once you start adding 200 units and it's on one bill, it's a lot of water every day. So here, we also would exclude, going forward, we would change an ordinance to exclude 6 inches or 8-inch from the schedule. They would automatically have to do a study because the amount of water a 6 or 8-inch line can bring into your building is gigantic. So even if you said, I'm going to use, 20 gallons a day, your capacity amount is so ginormous comparatively. There'd be no way to catch that other than having to go after the fact and bring them back in. So we're just going to exempt them right off the bat. And like I said, to my knowledge, I don't think we've had a 6 or an 8-inch in my tenure here ever approach us. Most businesses that come in that are heavy users are going to be using a 4-inch line. And then the last thing was the code would be updated to change it to 15,000 gallons per day. And then, so that's for high water users. So the easiest way to explain it once again with high water users, they just require a study because their impact's greater. As far as the actual schedule, as Trustee Curtis was talking about, the schedule would be broken into 3 categories: residential, commercial, industrial. So here's a little overview on residential. So the formula that we used came out that one population equivalent is equal. The impact to us is worth $2,230. So what ends up happening is, and I'll show you on this next chart, is if you look at the chart here, there is a listing of types of residential that you would see. There is our existing fee. There is the IPA, estimated number of people equivalent that would live in one of those buildings. And then the proposed full PE cost is if you take that 2,230 and multiply it by the number of PE in that building. So, you do the math, 3.5 times 2,230 should equal 7,805. What we're saying is, even though that's what the formula is telling us, we want to make sure that not only are we competitive in the market for development, but we also want to right size it to the village. So when we do it, we came up with a number that's lower than 2,230 based on the amount of average water user in those categories of residential homes. And we think the PE to our water system, not using industry standards, but using our own water system, is closer to 1,300. It actually came up to 1,271. But since January is a winter month and their usage is typically down a little bit, we rounded it up to 1,300 to account for summer months. So now using that 1,300, we multiply it by the number of IEPA PEs per category, and that would be the new connection. So the easiest way of looking at this is single family homes. New home comes in. Today, they're spending $35.88 to connect to our system. We're proposing it goes to $45.50. And this is a really good example on how it would break down for multifamily. So as I said, what we're seeing in the industry is when apartments come in, one building has a service, it breaks up into multiple units. What we're saying is this is based on an actual building that came into town. So if you look here, that building included 2 studio apartments. So this is all serviced off of one line. Two studio apartments, 8 one-bedroom apartments, and 10 two-bedroom apartments for a total of 20 units on that one building. They paid a fee of $11,000, but in theory, they should have paid closer to $98,000 because the amount of water they're actually using is way more than what our fee is to catch up to it. Now, what we're saying is, if we apply that reduced number that we used in the single family category, because we believe water users are less than what the industry standard says in our town, then that fee would have gone from $10,765, and the permit for that building would have been $57,200 for that apartment building. Clearly much larger, still 5 times larger than what it is today. But once again, that's because we're not catching the exponential impact of those larger buildings.
Hey, Steve, do you have any idea how that compares to local surrounding areas?
And so other
you gonna
towns
tell
are
me?
using PEs. We know of one town that actually uses EEI and did a rate study and everything and used PEs. And I want to say another town next door to them is also going through this process. It's hard because every town is different. Every town uses a different, maybe a treatment method. They have different equipment to replace. And quite frankly, because our rates are so low, they could be accounting for things already in their rate increases to do things to lessen the connection fees. So for instance, here's a good way of saying it. The more you collect at the time of impact on development when they first come in, the lower you, in theory, would be able to keep your water rates because you're collecting that impact on the developer, not collecting it on the homeowner who's paying for the same usage every month.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. We don't want to run short-handed.
So when it comes to commercial, using that same, so Trustee Curtis, to your point, we did originally start off by using, the average amount. We were doing like the calculations differently, but now we decided it was much easier, instead of asking them to provide a PE, to just say, based on the average users in our accounts, where we already know what the average businesses use, and we have a good a good pool of businesses in each category to look at it, to see what the average is. You're taking our existing fee. Now you're looking at proposed commercial development, and it's a big jump. And that's because commercial typically uses more water than residential. But we know that we just passed an incentive agreement, not incentive agreement, but an incentive policy as part of our economic development plan. So that top right corner, you remember the board picked qualified uses. These are the businesses that you want to attract to town. So what we decided was we are going through a way, and this number could be changed. Obviously, this is all just for discussion and proposal to the board tonight. We said, well, if these are businesses that the board really wants, then why don't we start right off the bat and just say we're automatically going to discount those users 25% off our normal fee. So when they're looking to build a hotel or a restaurant in town, they're like, here's our fee schedule. You have a 25% reduction because you're a restaurant. And that, would be one way that we can stay competitive. The other thing, thought this would help. This is a chart Brandon put together based on some real users that we have in town. So for instance, if you look at that office building, anything in yellow is something the board said we want to attract that type of use. So you look at the office building, an office building's not something that we targeted as, that was one of our qualified uses for incentives. So that pays $23,000 at time of permit, but a restaurant with the same size meter gets basically a $6,000 discount right off the bat. Same thing with, we see car wash. That's not one of our normal things. They're using a 3-inch meter, $41,000 impact fee. But a large retail store like a Target might use a 3-inch meter. We want that. We're going to discount them from 41. That 25% takes it down to 31,000. Now, the most important thing to say about commercial, and Trustee Nedved, to your point about, other towns around us, when you're looking at commercial, we always have the ability to create an incentive agreement that's beyond this schedule. This would be by ordinance. This is our set schedule by ordinance. But and I'm just making up something, let's say it's a Costco or something, and the board is, we absolutely want Costco. It's not to say Costco can come to us and say, we want 100%, fee reduction or something in water. That would be a negotiation that would come to the board for review as an incentive agreement. So you could still incentivize a business beyond what's in the schedule. This is just, we don't even have to go and negotiate. We're just going to be more competitive and say, look, we're giving you a 25% discount because you're a qualified business we want, while still collecting an increased connection fee from what we currently gather.
I think it all makes sense. And speaking of other municipalities, I know that Yorkville, Oswego, and Montgomery are tapping into the DuPage water from Chicago. Their water rates just like tripled. Water is an issue. We got to make sure that we have proper water that you can drink and equipment that serves the people. And I think that's reasonable to ask people for extra hookup fees if they're going to be using more water.
And then
A reasonable approach. Precisely.
Yeah. So the last thing, and this is the last slide, but it just go back to show commercial, we had qualified uses. Industrial, we don't, because industrial was not flagged by the board as a desired use. So they just get the PE schedule that is based on the formula that we created, and that is the new impact fee for industrial. But industrial is also more likely to use more water. So, and that's what you're seeing, whether it's manufacturing or whatnot, especially the food users. So this is completely up to discussion. Otherwise, the plan minus any changes would simply be to bring an ordinance back addressing the large water users, moving their water study up to 15,000 gallons. It would come back with this new connection fee schedule, adopting this fee schedule for developments. And that's basically it.
I think that's reasonable. I'm good.
One last thing.
Yeah.
So that earlier in the presentation, that one that you says is what, 225,000 gallons they're using, like one outlier? Right?
Yep.
How would like some business comes in and says, yep, we're going to use that much per day?
So we have a business that wants to come in right now that is looking to use a high amount of water, not that high, but significant. And then we have an existing business in town that's also going through a study right now because their increase is very significant. And, you know, we're talking some of these users, we've had one business reach out to us. Nathan, I don't remember the total amount. Do you remember the amount of water they just threw out at us over off of Mitchell?
Don't remember the water, but the impact fee was would be several million.
Well,
I
that,
think it's like
yeah. that's what
Yeah,
I was
like
thinking.
250,000 gallons a day. And then we have another food,
Wow.
it's the
That
food
would-
users
that
that
would
typically
be-
use it. And here's the evidence of whether or not we're competitive by raising our connection fee still. Some of these businesses, we flat out tell them, you're going to have a study. That study, and this is why the study is so important versus a flat schedule. If you're not only going to create that much impact, your impact isn't just enormous on the system. It also matters where your business is on our system. So if you're going to build a business that uses 250,000 gallons a day, but you're in a part of town that has lower water pressure than everybody else, you may require a new tower to be built to create higher pressure. Towers are $7 to $10 million. So someone's impact fee, and I'm just using hyperbole here, could be $10 million when somebody else could be $1 million. And that's the point of the study. So before they even go into development, you're like, we can't ask the residents to build another tower just because your one business is going to, use food production here. This is what it would cost to the residents. You have to pay that impact because you're the one creating it.
So who pays the cost for the study, the water study? The person who's interested in the developer, the builder?
So the water study in per se isn't, it's basically them providing their engineering numbers to us using the formula that's already created and then working with them to fine tune the formula. I said everybody is different, right? So what I didn't go into because it starts getting into the weeds, but the formula includes things like on big users, what time of day they use water versus the average user. Because if it's summertime, for instance, and you're a big water user and you're using 400,000 gallons a day, that creates a bigger impact than a normal user would, because we now have to make sure that at the height of the drought season, when we're pumping more water to get it up to the tower to maintain it, we now have to create additional storage for a fire or something else to drain those towers. Your impact, because you do production midday and your busiest months are June, July, and August. That's also the time that our water system is under the most strain.
So it's really a review of their data by the staff to look into.
Correct.
Okay.
And one of the things we want them to do is, and the two that we've talked to is we always say, come back with your data, show us what where you're at and explain how you got to that number. Because ultimately, if it's a new user, we're taking their data because we don't know what
Or you're
they're
taking their word for it.
exactly.
What if they
at
open
first.
up a second shift, a third shift? Now it's million gallons a day.
Right.
They're
So
using-
there,
yeah,
I
they're
should have
using
said
two
there.
towers instead of one.
Right, well, what recourse would we have if it ultimately becomes, like you were making, when you were answering trustee Curtis' question, if they ultimately use much more than they said they were originally going to, then where does that leave us?
So a second. We were talking about changing provisions, and one of the things is that last bullet point. We want to put some language in that basically says, if you come in and you're using under 15,000 gallons a day, but you start to go over 15,000, we may require you to do an impact study. So now there's only one business that's even close to 15,000 gallons a day, a new business that's coming to town and they're using close to that amount. And they have multiple locations, so they have engineering numbers that show how much they should be using. If for some reason you see that it's 10,000, 9,000, 11,000, then it goes to 20. It's not that we're going to call you in right away and say, I mean, we have residents who go, we'll have 15,000 gallons in a 2-month cycle and then shoot up to 30 or 40, depending in the summer, if they're watering their grass or putting, water in a pool. So what we're looking for is your trend starts to head out after a few months. We're like, okay, you're clearly using more water than you ever said you were going to. We have the ability to go back and ask them to look at that impact. And what you're looking at isn't from 0 to that new number. You're looking at that number from 15,000 beyond. So your impact, you hit the 15,000, now you're using 20,000 a day. Your impact is the difference between the two.
And this is all new construction?
Yeah, so essentially this is all
Up
connection
fees.
fees on new construction. So on all categories. So no existing homeowner gets a connection fee unless they were building a new house.
What if a new business comes in and wants to use an existing building, but wants to create a business that does use more water than?
I think that's where we have to rely then on the 15,000 number of a high water user. And there was a good, Trustee Christensen, that's a good point, because if you go back to this category here, let me see if I can find it. This one here. If you look at these commercial accounts, you see in the 2-inch category, 2 inch is not a big line, but there's one business in town that uses 45,000 gallons every cycle, because the nature of their business uses it, and it's the type of business that what you would expect to use a lot of water, but it doesn't necessarily need a large line to service it. So that's how you catch the outlier. If that business was coming in and all of a sudden they're on an existing business and we see, and that was where I think Nathan was talking about potentially we might have to add some language in the building permit process that says, in the event that you shall ever go over 15,000 gallons, which is why we want updated numbers right at the beginning.
I'm good.
Yep,
Yeah, I think it sounds good.
good work in it.
Um,
It's a tough one. But- All right, nothing else on that. I guess we entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion adjourned.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, the same sign. Have a good night.